Hey everyone, welcome to Strange Stories, where we explore near-death experiences and supernatural stories from people who've had a glimpse of the other side. If you enjoy our content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Without further ado, let's get to the story of the day. This is going to be difficult. Even after many years of working together, I've never written it down and I've never been able to adequately express it to anyone. Here we go. When I was 16, I was betrothed to a guy who was into sadomasochism. To put it lightly, my parents were the worst types of drinkers and were extremely abusive. They felt being with this mad guy was cool or a badge of pride. He even ordered that I shot him once. He was going to do stuff to me. He would get angry if I smoked or wore cosmetics, so I begged for a cigarette this night while doing dishes while my parents were gone. He gave me one with that deadly glint in his eye that I'd grown to associate with peril. When he pulls the dish towel from my hands and begins snapping me with it, I light it and take one smoke. He wrapped it twice around my throat after several hard slaps, and I believe he had his hands together behind my neck. You should know that only 2 years prior, I had broken my neck in a driving accident and had to wear a neck brace for a year, so this was a major setback. I couldn't shout or talk, so I struggled in vain. I felt like I was receding as I saw his face diminish and the noises became muffled. I'd passed out in the ocean before, caught in the waves, and I remember thinking I'd pass out and wake up again. I had the impression that considerable time had passed. It was a speeding sensation that woke me up. I became aware that I was somewhere and at first waited for sight, hearing, and so on to return. But they did not. I was concerned about my physical state. I recall being strangled, struggling to breathe, becoming terrified, and everything becoming black. Then I realized I was in another place. It was terrifying and I had no idea what was going on. I was in a void with no sensation, and while that terrified me, it also felt comfortable. There's no cold, no heat, no sound, no beginning or finish. I was aware of it, but the fact that I knew that worried me much more. I accepted the fact that I was out of my body but still remained. I had progressed from believing in God to being angry with him, hating him, dabbling in witchcraft and Satanism, being numb, and ultimately turning to science. I was a pure scientist who had absolutely no faith in such things. Time passed in an odd way, and now I realize I was given the space I needed to accept reality and feel at ease. When I felt calm and at ease, I looked around, which is ironic because I wasn't seeing in the usual sense, but I did look and saw nothing. I felt I was damned and that hell was trapped in this abyss for all eternity. There was nothing, no matter how hard I tried. I got apprehensive, then perhaps resigned. But suddenly, I saw a tiny light. It could have been a pinhole in a piece of black fabric. It was extremely tiny. I gazed at it since it was the only thing to look at. I eventually dared to question what it was. I was there when I thought I wanted to get close enough to see what it was. It took my breath away. I peered through and saw a movie playing across with the void above, below, and behind it, and it appeared from nothing and faded into nowhere. It was life on Earth, and I knew these folks, but had forgotten about them or hadn't realized their significance to me and my life. I was feeling their sadness and delight, love and hope, despair, and so on. I was stuck, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions, thoughts, and dreams, both theirs and mine at the same time. In a strange sense, I believe this movie began before my birth and continued until my attack, and in a strange manner, a bit beyond that. As I was swept along and absorbed by this, I received heartbreaking understandings of those I hadn't realized I'd injured, of persons I thought were good but were actually evil, and of some I thought were bad seeds but were actually good. I saw myself as I'd never actually seen myself before, and I was embarrassed but also excited. I had to relive all of the awful torture, some of which I'd forgotten, in every agonizing detail all over again. I became conscious of another presence in my presence. This presence was so huge and unfathomable that I wasn't sure what I was feeling at first, but then I knew it was God. He was the beginning and the end of everything, and He was love. Without this encounter, I would never have discovered that love has the capacity to rival all real and perceived forces in the universe. My life review, which I didn't know what to name until somewhere in the last decade, accelerated as time passed. It was foreboding. All of this was coming at me at breakneck speed, and I knew if I got to the conclusion, I'd be dead. I believe it meant the second death because I was afraid and desperately wanted to put things right. I recall knowing my mission, knowing all the answers to my questions, and knowing I hadn't done what I was intended to do. It wasn't entirely my fault, but I didn't find myself blaming others, even though I was completely involved in the reality. I've often told folks that I'd rather stand nude in front of the entire world than go through this. There are no places to flee or hide. I began to pray, as it felt as if my eyes were closed, my hands clasped, and I was on my knees pleading with God for another opportunity. I assured Him I would go through it all again 10 times for another opportunity. Recognize the significance of this statement. It's not like saying to someone right now, "I'd do it again," since it's far more profound and has an indelible influence. I watched this movie from time to time, hoping that if it slowed down, it meant I'd return to my life in that moment, whether I was a 2-year-old, a 10-year-old, or even older than I was when this event ended my life. It accelerated quicker than seemed conceivable, and the force of it slammed into me. I suddenly realized I had reached the finish. I felt much older, as if I had traveled far further than my 16 earthly years. I felt like I was falling into the void and assumed I was lost, not forgiven and damned. I waited, almost holding my breath, eyes closed, terror and dread filling me, and I couldn't force myself to look or listen. I felt like a long time had passed, and then I had a tiny sensation of movement, and I recall thinking I was traveling very quickly toward a goal, but I didn't have the typical references like things, lights, or feeling air pass by. I was still not looking because I was terrified, but then I heard something, a very distant, very small sound. It became deafeningly louder and louder. I can only describe it as a trillion church bells ringing all at once. It was indescribable, and it escalated in volume beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible. But it was unusual since I couldn't feel it in my body like I would when hearing such a loud sound. It seemed like I was traveling through a tunnel. And then there was another sound beyond all of that. I strained my ears to hear it. It was a guy. He was muttering something. "You're faking it. You bitch, you're faking," he exclaimed. I stared as I heard him loudly as if he were there in front of me. He was supporting my weight. I noticed the towel dangling from his hand and believe I'm being forcibly pulled around and slapped in the face. I realized he was supporting my weight when I quickly got up but couldn't move back since the countertop was shoved into my backside. He seemed as terrified as I'd ever seen him, and for a moment, we just looked deeply into each other's eyes, searching, I believe, and he walked back a few steps in complete stillness. I stood there thinking I should be angry or call the cops, but I wasn't, so I didn't. "Give me a smoke," was all I could say, to which he replied, after a brief pause, "You've already got one." I looked at my hands, puzzled, and motioned with my empty palms. "I don't have a cigarette with me." He pointed to the ground. When I looked down, I noticed that an entire cigarette had burned up in the linoleum, creating a long burn. It wasn't burning anymore, and at first, I wondered why he would tell me to pick up the filter when there was no cigarette left. But then it hit me. That's the cigarette I was smoking, the one I just lit up before he came in. I'm not sure how long I stood there staring at the butt, but I looked up after a while and asked for another. He was still standing there, and after a moment's hesitation, he handed me one. I remember I stood there smoking it and staring at him for a long time, but the events of the previous minutes didn't seem to matter anymore. I understood awareness and knowledge, and I was a different person as a result.